Hello and welcome to the 8th retrospective of the Final Fantasy video game series, where I look at the 8th game, Final Fantasy VIII, and ask why you should play this game. These videos are meant to be a retrospective looking at each game individually. It's not designed for vast comparisons across the series. It is, however, a series retrospective done sequentially in order as I've played through each game one by one and observed how the series has evolved through that time. And with my knowledge of where Final Fantasy would go from here, it's very weird to say where Final Fantasy VIII fits within the series. There are only a few games where the term Black Sheep is thrown around. It's used occasionally to describe the online multiplayer games Final Fantasy XI and XIV. Although they are massively popular games with very dedicated fan bases, Final Fantasy XIV might even be the most popular game in the Final Fantasy series with the most players ever that game has touched, so calling a Black Sheep has always felt disingenuous. Then you've got Final Fantasy III and Final Fantasy V, two-dimensional games that originally were never released in Western markets, and took a very long time to properly be released over here, and so never got the intended nostalgic audience that the original generation of players had. Those games are potentially Black Sheep. Final Fantasy II, for its grueling difficulty and just bizarre levelling up system, is often called a Black Sheep. Final Fantasy XIII, for reasons I will come to in that video, is sometimes considered a black sheep. The term is interesting because it implies that a game is critically flawed. I don't think there's a single game in the series that is more critically flawed than Final Fantasy VIII. And that's weird because it's not a bad game. It's a very, very good game. It just has a fundamental issue that turns so many people off, that make them, after loving Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII, despair whenever they attempt this game. It doesn't affect all players. I also know an equal number of people who will defend this game to the death. It is loved. And my recent marathon playthrough, the first time I've ever actually finished the game after 6 attempts of trying, I can finally sort of step back and try and understand where they're coming from, because there is a truly great game here. It builds upon what Final Fantasy VII did. It has excellent turn-based combat. I would actually even argue on a moment-to-moment gameplay, in places it's stronger than Final Fantasy VII. It looks better, it's had a graphical overhaul, the characters look realistic. With the modern remastered version of the game, where we're not restricted to only 320 pixels, it actually looks really good for a system designed in the late 1990s. This is fantastic. The story, the central story of Final Fantasy VIII is strong. The protagonists are largely interesting, although they don't stand out the same way that protagonists of other games of the series do. The problem with Final Fantasy VIII is that more than any other game in the series, including Final Fantasy II, it makes you hyper aware of the process of leveling your characters up and grinding in a way that is not complicated. It sets a horrible first impression with the tutorial system, but it's just not fun to engage with. Now, it has its defenders. I don't think it's a critically flawed system. There was, when they came up with the idea, something really cool about saying, we're going to tie magic properly into the way your characters level up. That's an interesting idea. But the truth is, if you want to play Final Fantasy VIII, you have two approaches and ways of going about it if you really want to enjoy this game. You can really dive into the mechanics and the random number generation and the close your game, reload a save file and restart and aim for the perfect run where you get all of the magic and all of the cards, and you turn your characters into literal gods. Or, conversely, the less you know about the mechanics and what's going on behind the scenes in Final Fantasy VIII, the less you engage with the role-playing aspect of this video game, I think the more fun you'll have. Because knowing a little about the way Final Fantasy VIII works, knowing what it's going to do and what you need to do in order to level up and power up your characters, will make the game severely disappointing. I want to deep dive into why this is. Structurally, it follows a lot from Final Fantasy VII. You have a core cast of characters with a moody protagonist. This time Squall is genuinely moody, although he has good reasons to be. He's a child soldier, grown up to become a teenager. He's bred for war. He's gently amnesiac. He doesn't remember much of his childhood. What he does remember is repressed because he grew up in an orphanage. He had no one he could rely on. You get flashbacks to him calling up his big sister who abandoned him. He's had an unhappy life, and his way of surviving is just to shut down, close off all the emotional connections and just say, well, I have a career. I have a job, I have things I need to do, and by shutting out emotional connections is his way of surviving. The storyline in the game of Final Fantasy VIII is wonderfully conceived. There's a great story here of him actually elevating and opening up and rediscovering what it is to be human. The central plot of Final Fantasy VIII is a love story, and it's probably the best love story in the series. Squall and Rinoa, after a really awkward start, the things they go through, the things they do together before the end of the game are fantastically conceived. It's really inventive and imaginative in a way that very few Final Fantasy games are. But the setting and the world around them is simultaneously the blankest and the plainest and the most empty of any game. Squall and Rinoa are almost perfect, but there's no exposition that really settles you into an understanding of this world. There are great ideas here. There's wonderful lore behind the game, with a backstory involving multiple generations of sorceresses, a magical curse passed on from not mother to daughter, but definitely sorceresses descending through the ages, different generations of them, different women being imbued with this curse, this magical power, and in the far future, the sorceress at the end of time reaching back to try and wreak her revenge for this curse upon previous generations. The way that impacts upon the running of the Garden Balam, where this mercenary outfit that Squall works for is ordained, where it impacts upon other characters you meet throughout the game, and Rinoa herself. It's a really good story. And when you reach the point where Squall, this emotionally repressed man, finally admits to himself, I love her, I need her, and the extent he's going to go through to make sure he saves that relationship, I'm fully on board. If you ignore all of the role-playing aspects of Final Fantasy VIII and just play it as a turn-based action game, I think there's a lot to love here. But what is not explained to you, and I don't want to use these videos to go into the lore, I haven't done it for almost any other game, but in most other Final Fantasy games the magic system is clearly explained to you. In Final Fantasy VI we had Magicite. Magic comes from the summons. In Final Fantasy VII we had Materia. Magic comes from these stones. In Final Fantasy 1 to 5, magic was linked to the crystals. In future games, there will be an explanation, but Final Fantasy VIII, magic can be drawn from enemies by using these guardian forces, by using the summons. You can draw and extract magic from enemies as you play through the game, or from certain draw points that are physically in the map that you'll encounter. You can then equip that magic onto your weapons or onto your stats. So you can use the Cure spell in your inventory to give yourself more HP. You can use fire magic to give yourself more strength. You can vary in by gaining lots of different summons, which give you access to attaching different magic to different stat points. You can manipulate and control the way your characters will have different statistics through the game. This has two major downsides. The first, and I think most obvious, is it turns people off from using magic. Every time you cast a spell, you are depleting one of your stats. And for a very large proportion of neurotic people, that's a source of anxiety. Why would I consume magic if it makes me weaker? It's a trade-off that I think a lot of people suffer with, but it's not the critical flaw. The critical flaw is the method of gaining magic in the first place. Because there are two ways to go about it, and the most common way that I've seen people do is they just, when they encounter a new enemy, they spend up to 5 minutes just drawing, because you can infinitely draw magic from a single enemy. It doesn't deplete, it doesn't run out. Battles, where you just encounter a new enemy and you go, oh, it's got a new spell, and you can waste 15 minutes drawing up to 100 spells per character from the same enemy, whilst also having to do various items or use items or cast Cure on yourself, depleting your stats to stop the enemy killing you. This is not fun. It's interminable. It makes almost every combat in the game a slog. While you check, is there any new magic? Is there anything I can draw from this enemy? Yes, there is. Oh, I have to waste time drawing magic. I don't think the developers intended for this to be the way you're meant to play the game. When you actually understand a bit more about it, what you're meant to do is the enemies drop items. And there's a wonderful side quest, and it's possibly one of the best innovations of Final Fantasy VIII, a card game called Tetra Triad that you can use. You eventually get the ability to convert items into cards or cards into items, and then those items can be refined into magic. You're not meant to waste time and hours and hours and hours of your life just drawing magic from enemies. You're meant to collect items. The enemies drop items. Those items can be refined. Once the summons develop the skills, you can just create magic from thin air. For people who really understand this game, who really understand the mechanics, they can get the highest, almost the highest level spells before they complete the first dungeon. They can then trounce through the rest of the game. It's one of the easiest in the franchises. But this is not explained well to you, and there's no lore connection on why the source of magic for this entire world should be related to a card game. There's no explanation for that. There's no logical connection the player could make that would introduce this to you. The next problem is, and it does sort of explain this to you but not clearly, there's no point grinding against enemies to level up. As you fight enemies, they will level up alongside you and just become as strong as you are. So unlike every other Final Fantasy game in the series, by fighting enemies you do not gain an advantage. There is no grinding. Everything comes down to how much magic you have at your disposal and what summons you have at your disposal, which allow you to attach that magic to different stat points in your character sheets. The summons will become available throughout the story, so you're locked off from some of those advantages until certain points along the game. That's probably a good thing, but it just makes no sense. It's not logical for new players new to this world to come into. And that's where Final Fantasy VIII falls down, because for people coming off the high of fantastically conceived and balanced games, Final Fantasy VIII, because of these flaws in the way the magic system and the stat system works, is the most unbalanced game in the series. You can make it as easy or as difficult as you like. Doing so depends on how much time you're prepared to put into it, and a lot of random number generations and closing and restarting the console because the game has just decided it doesn't like you. And this is a shame. It's really stupid. It's really unfair. My only advice for this game is ignore all that. Don't convince yourself you need a completionist run. A lot of the side quests in the second half of this game, when it opens up, are the most tedious that there are in the series. But the core adventure is fantastic. The pacing is a bit weird. The storytelling is a bit weird. I hate the terminology, it gets good the more you play, but the truth is they were trying something very experimental. Squall, as a moody teenager who has shut himself from the outside world, this game will only explain itself to you at the rate that Squall understands what's going on. You as the player have very little knowledge that Squall does not have. And as this is a very mysterious and very complex storyline involving time travel, involving generations of magical lore that are not very well explained, involving flashbacks to a previous generation and a war that happened 20 years ago. If Squall doesn't understand it, you don't understand it. And there's a lot of weird, quite fun, when it all comes together and it hits hard. But for a lot of this game, you'll be going, I don't understand. Because Squall's not interested in all that. Squall doesn't care about the world. Squall cares about himself, and then eventually he cares about Rinoa. And only when the world impacts upon Rinoa does Squall take action, and you actually start to piece everything together and the massive jigsaw of the storyline that is Final Fantasy VIII start to make sense. And I think that's, for some people, extremely disappointing. The plot and the storyline of Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII, as they developed their artistic prowess through these games, were just logical. There were mysteries, there were questions, but at least you always had a sense of what you're doing and your purpose. Final Fantasy VIII delights from throwing very weird, very abstract stuff at you and then explaining 10 to 15 hours later what was going on. And I can see why some people adore this, because when it explains itself, it does all come together, and the core storyline with Squall and Rinoa, so it's more than satisfactory, it's brilliant. But everything else around them is deliberately not the focus of the attention. Almost all of the other characters besides those two don't get the time and effort applied to them that they deserve. Whereas in Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII, almost every character had a special dungeon or story arc specifically attributed to them. There's one story arc here that all of the other characters besides Squall and Rinoa fit into. There's one very weird exposition-heavy plot twist that's revealed towards the end of the second disc of the game. They all just fill archetypes. They're all there to just be Squall's team, Squall's comrades. And I don't dislike any of them. They're all perfectly fine realised characters, but the focus and the singular attention this game applied to one central storyline, the love story, if you buy into that, you'll love this game. If you don't buy into it, if you get turned off by the statistics, the weird levelling system, Squall's personality, just the sheer amount of stuff in this story that don't make sense puts you off. The number of players I've seen burn out from this halfway through Disc 2, the number of times I've done it myself, it can be difficult. But persevere through the end of Disc 2. Actually get to the point where the storyline starts to wrap itself together, where it starts to finalise its story, and there's something incredibly rewarding about Final Fantasy VIII. I've spent half of this review admonishing this game, telling you what it does wrong, but the truth is, you can ignore most of these things it does wrong. You can either dive in and just overcome them by sheer willpower, or just say, well, this is behind the scenes game mechanics, it doesn't matter to me. What this game has to offer is a very specifically told love story between two really engaging characters. And it's just a quirk of the storytelling that there's a lot of weird and obnoxious stuff to get through. If you persevere, it will tie itself together beautifully before the end.